Well, there can be few more pressing issues in today's world than genocide. Tonight, we are privileged to have with us one of the United States' foremost experts on genocide, on other gross violations of human rights, and on the response of our country to such atrocities. It is easy, and I think right, to be outraged at genocide. We see the faces of people threatened with death, and our hearts go out to them. We see the corpses of those already killed, and anger rises within us. We think of values that our country is built upon and can imagine few more noble acts than helping to end the suffering we see. But outrage isn't all that we feel. We worry about the dangers of getting involved. We find it all too complicated to understand. We assume that others will take the lead. In short, our more noble impulses conflict with our more selfish ones. Samantha Power's work is remarkable because it forces us to confront not only gross abuses of human rights, but also our morally complicated reaction to them. Her work is inspiring because it addresses both of those things with wisdom, eloquence, and the meticulous marshaling of supporting evidence. She is a leading academic, an award-winning journalist, and a valued political advisor. She is a public intellectual in the very best sense of that term. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, is accessible to anyone with an interest in the subject, but also is a sophisticated and powerful analysis of U.S. foreign policy responses to 20th century genocides. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Power to IPFW.
It's great to be here as part of such an incredible lecture series. It's daunting to look into the program and see who's coming after me and who came before in the annals of this lecture series. But I understand that following Carl Bernstein, it's a low bar. So I don't know if that's good news or bad news. Bad news for you, good news for the successor speaker who actually comes prepared. And I'm not just saying that because I work for Barack Obama and not Hillary Clinton. It's great. There's an amazing energy on the campus around this lecture series, and I've really enjoyed my day here, specifically with students. I had felt like I was in the crossfire and the crosshairs of some of the most rigorous interrogations that one could get in terms of foreign policy here today in doing a student forum. And that's a testament to the students and the caliber and the curiosity of people who come here, but also to the teachers who seem here to take their jobs very, very seriously and to really respect the students that they have and put an awful lot of time and effort into being there for them. And so, you know, again, as one who teaches at Harvard, this is a very unfamiliar environment. So that kind of regard for students is a breath of fresh air. I am going to talk about the age of genocide this evening, because that's how the talk was billed. But I encourage you in the discussion period to ask questions or make comments about whatever you would like to. The presidential race is something that I'm spending a huge amount of time on with Barack Obama steadily gaining. The odds makers are shifting odds. The Yankees are on the demise and the Red Sox are on the rise. And happy to talk about that, happy to talk about American foreign policy more generally, but I am going to speak specifically about genocide and about how the larger trends in American foreign policy relate to that particular crime in this particular century. So before I do that, though, I want to go back and just paint a picture of a particular moment back in 1994, 13 years ago, more than 13 and a half years ago, April 1994. And I know a number of the students that I met with today, many of them had seen Hotel Rwanda, the film, so you probably know what I'm talking about. That is, in April 1994, there commenced the fastest killing spree of the 20th century, faster and more efficient even than the Holocaust, even than what Hitler, with all of his mechanization and sinister forethought, was able to devise. That was the extermination of 800,000 Rwandan Tutsi and moderate Hutu. And the two scenes, I want to paint just two scenes for you from that period, specifically from the first month of the genocide, which is April. The first scene occurs, or is set, I guess you'd say, in the State Department in Washington on April 7th, 1994. And what happened on April 7th was that a number of journalists gathered in front of a podium like this one to hear the State Department spokesperson, Michael McCurry, talk about what had just happened in Rwanda the day before. And what had just happened in Rwanda the day before is the plane carrying the Rwandan president had been shot down. And what had happened in the wake of the shooting down of the plane is that Rwandan government officials and militia had set about exterminating Tutsi in the capital city of Kigali. And Michael McCurry, the State Department spokesperson, had access to intelligence from the field and was getting updates about what was going on in Rwanda. And everybody out there, the journalists who were out there, there were only probably 50 in the briefing room at the time, but they were all very aware of what was underway. Now, they weren't quite sure, was it genocide or was it systematic violence against the Tutsi that might at some point soon give rise to civil war? You know, was it something morally actionable, or was it something that we could shrug about and chalk it up, as people did, unfortunately, especially in those days, to tribal violence, and tribal violence that people were especially prone to say happened from time to time in Africa? Well, regardless of what the fact pattern was, the reality was that the newspapers and the wires and the intelligence reports were indicating that thousands of Tutsi were being killed. And at the podium, Mike McCurry gave way to a U.S. government official named Prudence Bushnell. And Prudence Bushnell stepped up to the microphone. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and she had just been to Rwanda about 2 to 3 weeks before. And so while other people read about dead Rwandans, she had in mind particular friends of hers or particular acquaintances of hers that she'd met on the trip. So she gets up and she gives this incredibly moving account of what's happening, not only to ordinary civilians, but also to U.S. Embassy employees who are Tutsi. And the journalists kind of sit there, and all they're interested in is the evacuation of U.S. Embassy personnel, of Americans, of Westerns. They don't know Hutu from Tutsi, from Tutu from Hutsi. It makes no sense. It's all new. All of the knowledge that we now have in our society about Rwanda is post-genocide knowledge. And so at the time, people who were people of good faith and good education and great curiosity simply didn't know much. And so thus they focused on the one thing they did know, which is that there were U.S. families, and rightly focused on the U.S. families that were at stake. So Bushnell was up there, and she knew all this about Rwandans. No one's asking about the Rwandans. And at a certain point, no one's asking about anything, so she leaves the podium. And Michael McCurry comes back. The Rwanda section of the briefing is over. As you know, 800,000 people would end up exterminated over the next 100 days, 99 days, 800,000 people. But at that time, it was only several thousand, maybe 10,000. Nobody was fully clear. So Bushnell leaves, McCurry comes back, and he just looks down at his paper and he says, okay, what's next on the agenda? And it turns out what's next on the agenda is the failure of foreign governments to screen the film Schindler's List, and the importance of the United States speaking out on the failure of some governments to show this film or to give proper attention to this film. And so McCurry goes into this impassioned denunciation of this omission by governments and by societies elsewhere. No one, not Bushnell, not McCurry, nor any of the journalists gathered made any connection between what was going on in Rwanda and what was being denounced to and had occurred 50 years before. And this, to me, this scene, which is so innocent and so human, it's just, very few people can walk and chew gum at the same time, and the focus on the Holocaust is itself worthy, and the education The fact that so many of the young people on this campus would have read about the Holocaust in high school and middle school even, that's so important. And what was going on in Rwanda was itself intrinsically incredibly important. But this disconnect, this failure to connect between what we've learned and the lessons we say we plan to apply on the one hand, and then what we do in the present in the face of mass atrocities, what has driven my work in this area, and I think the activism and the advocacy of so many now, tens of thousands of people in this country on Darfur. So that's scene number one, is just the disconnect, the fact that people haven't made those connections in the past. The second sort of scene from Rwanda that I want to share with you before talking about American foreign policy and its relationship to this issue and citizens' relationship to this issue occurs a couple weeks later. It's in late April, April 23rd, and a wonderful congresswoman named Patricia Schroeder from Colorado is speaking again before the press. And she's asked by the press, the press some journalist says, well, why aren't we, what's the deal? Rwanda, it's now up to like 100,000, 200,000, against 2 to 3 weeks since the McCurry thing. All these Rwandans are dying, and how come the Congress is so quiet? How come there's no press conferences, there's no, about that as such? No hearings, no letters to the president, no protests. What's the deal? Why is Rwanda not registering? And Schroeder gives one of the most deeply honest answers I think a public servant could give. And she says, it's a great question. We're getting all kinds of telephone calls to the district in Colorado and to our office in Washington about the fate of the endangered ape population in Rwanda, but nobody's calling about the people. The phones are just not ringing. The endangered gorillas, huge amount of advocacy and so forth, but no one is calling about the endangered Rwandans. And this, again, in a nutshell, I think, tells you something fundamental about the 20th century, in that there was no endangered peoples movement. There were endangered species movements, perhaps got insufficient resources, and certainly, as we know, have had insufficient success in many cases. But at least if you were talking about the endangered apes, and if suddenly they came under siege, there was an actionable constituency out there, a mobilizable group of people who would stand up and do something and make calls and at least make their presence felt. And that's who she was hearing from. So what does this mean? What can we learn from the 20th century, and then where do we go from there? And what can we apply today? Well, I looked at a bunch of cases: the Armenian genocide in 1915, the Holocaust, Pol Pot's campaign of slaughter in Cambodia, killing 2 million people. Incidentally, just this week, believe it or not, one of the leading perpetrators of Pol Pot's genocide, his right-hand man, Ieng Sary, was arrested, dislodged from power in 1979, and so lived out his retirement years for almost 30 years, free to go as he pleased. And then lo and behold, I think he's now 83 years old, he was just arrested with his wife. So it's a small footnote, small testament to the persistence, actually, just of advocates, of genocide advocates. But I looked at the Armenians, the Holocaust, Cambodia, Saddam Hussein's genocide against the Kurds in northern Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia, and identified, it didn't take much to do the identification, but a pattern of response. And I focused on the United States, not because I think the United States by any means needs to be the world's policeman or can be the world's policeman, but because the United States speaks out and seems to have a constituency more oriented toward genocide and specifically toward the Holocaust than just about any other country on the earth other than Germany and Israel. Moreover, of course, the United States, because of its great power, military and economic, diplomatic, had the capacity potentially to achieve more with less. And America was my country and the country I was most interested in focusing on. But many of the patterns I described for you here are patterns that would apply more generally to democracies. And we can talk again in the discussion period about other actors and their failures and what can be done in those domestic debates to change responsiveness. So, but in the United States, if one looks at that vast sort of case sample, one sees a few, I think, recurrent patterns. One is that I like to think about American foreign policy and policymakers as having a toolbox. And in the toolbox, you have, on the one hand, diplomatic and economic measures that you can take. And then on the other, very extreme side, you have military measures you can take. Now, on the diplomatic and the economic side, there's so many things that one could do. And you see many of these tools taken out of the toolbox with regard to national security threats or anything that threatens economic interests and so forth. So you could denounce a form of behavior. You could threaten to prosecute, because we developed the tools of prosecution late in the 20th century. You could freeze the assets of a perpetrator of crimes against humanity, genocide, et cetera. Often those assets are available in foreign banks. You could impose an arms embargo. You could close an embassy. You could expel an ambassador from a genocidal regime who happens to be seated at the UN. There are a lot of things you can do, diplomatically or economically. The idea is to create costs, to create incentives and disincentives. Then you make your way, of course, into the realm of policing or military measures. You could create no-fly zones to prohibit planes, like those in Sudan today, from strafing civilians. You could do radio jamming. That was proposed in the Rwandan genocide. For $8,500 an hour, we could have conceivably used our technology, actually at minimal risk, to U.S. pilots or soldiers, but to block the radio that was being used to broadcast the names and addresses of potential Tutsi victims. But that price was deemed too steep. You could create safe areas of the kind that were created in the 1990s. They were never terribly safe, unfortunately, but you could actually ensure that there were actual peacekeepers on the ground. You could make them out of country, so that civilians could just, as long as they could make it out of Rwanda into Burundi or into Congo, there'd be something there awaiting them, some form of safety, or internally, like we did eventually after the first Gulf War in northern Iraq. The point is, there's a range of tools that could be made available to policymakers. Some can be done bilaterally by one country toward another abusive country. Some, by definition, have to be done regionally or have to be done internationally, multilaterally. But it's a toolbox. And in the face of genocide, for the most part, in the 20th century, that toolbox remains shut. The second part of the pattern, very related to what I've just described, is that if one looks at policy responses and how they get generated, there's the president and his or her foreign policy team, and then there's the rest of us in the press, in the Congress, citizens, particular constituencies, students, evangelicals, Jewish group, you name it. And what was amazing about the cases that I've mentioned is the degree to which not only did the toolbox remain closed shut, but also it remained, the executive branch operated amid a kind of society-wide silence. So it wasn't as if the executive branch was defying popular will by looking away from atrocities of this magnitude. It was indeed being indulged by popular will. It wasn't facing any pressure, any significant pressure anyway, from below. Now, there is one exception to that general rule, and that was Bosnia. Because I think the victims were white, because they were in Europe, because the Olympics had occurred in Sarajevo back in 1984, there was a certain proximity, because it was right after the Cold War, because the refugees were fleeing into European capitals, and therefore, even if you yourself had never visited the former Yugoslavia, you at least identified with the region in which the crimes were being carried out. So for a range of reasons, the press took, including myself, took what was going on in the Balkans very, very seriously. We were hugely unsuccessful, dramatically unsuccessful, in that there was a massive amount of press coverage of these crimes and a very paltry policy response. But nonetheless, what one can see is that because of the press coverage and because of the editorial coverage, not just the journalistic coverage, but the fact that editorial boards and editorial writers were saying, we should stop this, there shouldn't be concentration camps again in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust. But because of that, the toolbox was opened. It has to be said, it was opened. And some of those softer sanctions, the diplomatic, the economic, those were in fact undertaken, and with reasonable success, although it took time. Eventually, Bosnia is in fact the case that proves the rule, which is that cacophony of voices of people who did take it seriously, of Jewish groups who saw emaciated men behind barbed wire again in Europe and thought, whoa, there but for the grace of God, or who thought, I said never again, now I've got to bring it to life. Those groups teamed up with foreign policy elites who, after the Cold War, thought that the United States would be able to dictate the terms of the New World Order, and were humiliated by the fact that a tin pot dictator in the Balkans was standing up to the United States, who in turn teamed up with human rights advocates on the far left, teaming up with Richard Pearl, who now became, a legendary, an infamous neocon behind the Iraq War. But you had George Soros, kind of, leftist, progressive philanthropist, teaming up with Jeane Kirkpatrick, Reagan's former ambassador to the UN, a very cacophonous tent of advocates who wanted something done. But what that did was, in the end, it created such significant pressure that not only did the toolbox get opened, but indeed by 1995, President Clinton faced such pressure and was so himself embarrassed by the noise and by the degree of outrage and activism on the part of elites as well as grassroots, that in the end he even got involved militarily. But to get involved militarily, I'm going to talk about Iraq in just a second and what this means for the equation. But back then, to get involved militarily, to put that on the line, it wasn't enough to hear noise. You had to actually, as a politician, probably face cost. You had to actually feel like you were going to pay some price domestically. And that's what actually happened in the case of Bosnia. But all the other cases I mentioned, society-wide silence, toolbox shut, no political costs, and substantial imagined risks of investing your prestige, your pulpit, your voice, your economic policies, using up political capital that might be used somewhere else. So in a way, it's not a coincidence. I used to say when I first started my project, I thought, well, it's so strange. Like, why? Genocide is so bad. Why wouldn't you see governments doing the little things, at least? Just the little teeny-weeny things. And then you come to realize as you talk to policymakers, and I interviewed, 400 U.S. policymakers for the book, who to actually find out what their experience was like during these crimes. But in fact, doing the little thing means that you might be on the hook to do the big thing. So it's better not to invest your credibility or your stature at all. And so it's actually not a coincidence. It's kind of almost this all-or-nothing approach, which I don't think is a healthy approach, but it's very much a political approach. So stay away. Now, the good news is the third part of the pattern, or the third pattern that one sees in the 20th century, is that for all of this, there is a countervailing trend, which is that you have what I used to call upstanders, so not bystanders, but upstanders, people within the U.S. government or outside it, who are willing to risk their careers, risk their standing, their credibility internally, because these aren't fashionable issues. These certainly weren't fashionable issues to take hold of. But to take ownership of them, to lead, they were willing to pay a price. And so there are a range of people. One of them is an Indianan, who was mentioned to me earlier by one of you, Frank McCloskey, member of Congress from Bloomington, actually lost his race for Congress in that sweep in 1994. And one of the main reasons he lost, at least if the focus groups back then are to be believed, was that he spent more time thinking about Bosnia than Bloomington. That was the rap. I'm not sure that was a fair rap, but he certainly took a number of visits to the Balkans. I met him there for the first time where I was a journalist. But here is somebody who, again, you could say didn't represent maybe his constituents. He probably was, I'm sure he was speaking more about Bosnia than his constituents themselves, if polled, would have had him speak, but had made a profound difference in getting an arms embargo imposed on the Serbian government, on pushing for denunciation, on creating a peace process. A profound difference in the lives of people in the Balkans. And he's just a guy from Bloomington. There are others. Raphael Lemkin is one of the people I profile in the book, who was a Polish Jew who immigrated to the United States in the early 1940s and lost 49 members of his family in the Holocaust. He actually is the person who invented the word genocide, which, believe it or not, didn't exist, even though the crime had existed from Genesis forward. There'd never been a word for it until he invented the word in the United States in the early 1940s, and then became the leading advocate for the word, for the prevention of the crime, the prohibition of the crime, got the word admitted into Webster's dictionary and the Oxford English Dictionary, and then got a law passed at the UN General Assembly simply by pestering people. Just by getting in people's way, by being annoying, and just by refusing to let them forget what had just happened to his family and to other victim groups in human history. So one of the reasons that we even talk about genocide, that there can be a talk entitled The Age of Genocide, is this guy Lemkin, this random immigrant, asylum seeker, refugee, who changed international law forever. And by putting a convention banning genocide on the books in the 1940s, in 1948, created a placeholder. Nothing was done about it for many, many years. No courts, no action, no policing action, very few sanctions of any kind, as I've mentioned. But what happened was it was on the books, and in the early 1990s, when people began to look to Bosnia to see what could be done, there was a judicial idea floating around that he had put in place 50 years before. And that was that courts would be created, and that even if you didn't stop these crimes, you would punish them after the fact, and the leading perpetrators would not be allowed remain at large. So Lemkin and McCloskey and these people, their impacts are not felt, in fact, in their lives. Both died way too young and very broken by their experiences, and I think in large measure by their advocacy on genocide specifically. But their impact felt afterwards. These are the upstanders, and these were a striking feature of the American historical story that I would never have been aware of had I not just begun to delve in and look at the bad news. You get the good news, which is the people who take the promise of never again very, very seriously. So, what now? That was the 20th century. Where are we? What happened? Did we learn anything after all that? You do a big fat 500-page book. People read it. Does it? What? So what? So if we understand, does the diagnostic mean anything? Does it mean that policymakers are inclined to learn, or is the national interest and the emphasis on national security as defined in the short term, or on economic interests, is it so great that mere genocide can never rise, can never penetrate? That was the question that I was asking myself, certainly in the late 1990s. But a few things happened that I think can give one hope, but that hope has to be a cautionary hope, which I'll get to. First thing that happened is you actually saw, in the wake of the belated intervention in Bosnia, two incidents of collective international action to stop the victim, to prevent the victims of mass atrocity from being wiped out. The first occurred in 1999 in March over the embattled Serbian province of Kosovo. Very controversial operation, but in the end, a lot of, very unfortunate things happened over the course of the NATO's action. But in the end, 1 to 2 million ethnic Albanians were given autonomy and were no longer vulnerable to ethnic cleansing and massacres of the kind that they had been vulnerable to. 5 months later, in the tiny little half island of East Timor off the coast of Indonesia, East Timor voted for independence. Indonesia, which had occupied East Timor since 1975, responded to that vote by burning the country down, literally burning the country down, and rounding up Timorese civilians and murdering them en masse. But lo and behold, just as had occurred in Kosovo, this time the international community came together, and it was actually China and a lot of the ASEAN countries, the Asian countries in the region, as well as Australia, Portugal, a former colonizer of East Timor. These countries came together with U.S. leadership and actually made it impossible for Indonesia to imagine being able to be welcomed back into the community of nations if it didn't stop its campaign of its rampage. So the Indonesians stopped. The Australian led a multinational force into Timor, and slowly but surely Timor was ushered to its independence. The country was still burnt down, but in the end, only between 1,000 and 2,000 people were killed, which is a huge number of people for an island, a country of only 800,000. But relative to what was on the verge of happening, very, very small. So you started to think in the late 1990s that something was afoot. The other thing that happened, I've already alluded to, which is the creation of war crimes tribunals to punish crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. Suddenly, at The Hague, you had a court for Yugoslavia, a court for Rwanda. You had a hybrid court being created for Cambodia that's just responsible for this arrest I mentioned of Pol Pot's #1 deputy. A hybrid court for Sierra Leone, where people got their limbs chopped off. Suddenly people were being prosecuted. Suddenly Charles Taylor, the most sort of the poster child for the unaccountable rogue, war criminal of the last decade and a half, is locked up behind bars. This judicial thrust, very much growing out of domestic pressure. So what you had were governments who didn't really want to, Western governments who didn't want to fully own this issue, didn't really want to make never again It wasn't that they wanted never again for genocide to happen, but they just didn't necessarily want to be the ones to make it happen, because that would entail risks. But they were prepared by the mid to late 1990s to open that toolbox and to begin thinking about what some of these other measures were. And in the case that the two cases I mentioned, even to put military forces at stake. Huge development. Like it, hate it, we can talk about it, but very different attitude toward mass atrocity than we had seen, and the pattern that I described. And another thing happened, and this is bringing us to the present. This is perhaps a more durable thing, because the trends that I've described so far could be one-offs. They could be about a particular moment in time or an overreaction to the bystanding of the 1990s. But what I'm about to describe, I think, is pretty substantial and pretty durable. And that is, we now have in this country, very much contrary to Patricia Schroeder's comment about the gorillas, the apes in Rwanda, and her lamentation that there was no effective lamentation that there was no endangered peoples movement, we have an endangered peoples movement in the United States. We have the beginnings, stirrings of an anti-genocide constituency, which is kind of amazing. It's crazy in a way when you think about all the things that Americans can be worried about and are worried about today, from the deficit to the fact that we're fighting 2 wars abroad, neither of which is going well, one of which is going catastrophically. North Korea, Iran, enrichment in Iran, the Arab-Israeli situation, the rise of China. There's so many things Americans could be worried about if they were going to worry about foreign policy, and yet they're worried about Darfur. They're worried about genocide. What's going on? How is that happening? Where is that coming from? Well, I think there are a number of sources. One part of it is just simply a reaction, a delayed reaction to the Holocaust education, and perhaps you might even argue an overreaction to the Rwanda learning. But the Rwanda generation, the Hotel Rwanda generation, young people in particular, take very, very seriously the fact that this happened not in black and white, but in color, and so very recently. It's now not as recent as it was. It's 13 years. But for younger people, it has brought the history books to life in a way I think that other crimes did not. For some, it was also that it was the Clinton administration that was in office, that for progressives or for Democrats who might have thought that Democrats would somehow care more about these kinds of things. Well, it turns out maybe Democrats might be more prone to do humanitarian intervention, but as it happened in the 1990s, they were less comfortable with the use of American power. And whereas conservatives, and these are broad generalizations, were more comfortable with the use of power, and some of them very moral and very moralistically interested in what was going on inside borders and the degree to which that would affect U.S. interests. But in both cases, you had slender constituencies for doing much of anything. But then suddenly, again, with this anti-genocide constituency, you had students, you had evangelicals, specifically those who'd worked in South Sudan and then who took the outrage about what had gone on there and applied it to Darfur, even though it was Muslims dying in Darfur. You had human rights-minded people who understood that it wasn't enough to write a check to Human Rights Watch, or you had to actually pick up the phone and be a little more political. You had high school students there are 300 chapters, high school chapters for students taking action to end genocide stand, and 700 college campuses right now. This movement, which has, good news and bad news associated with it in terms of results, but has introduced a few new concepts that I think I find kind of inspiring and pretty interesting, pretty radical, pretty 21st century, that may be worth, again, imparting. One is they've created a 1-800-genocide number. So for those of you who have, and I would have put myself in this camp certainly before these people came along, despite my work, who kind of want to do something, want to at least signal to my member of Congress, to my equivalent of Frank McCloskey today, that actually it does matter to me how the government, my government responds, and I'd like people to at least open up the toolbox. I'm not saying deploy American troops or invade or do anything like that, but just make Darfur a priority. See what you can do. See, as still the leading superpower, what tools are available to you. If you want to do that, you can call 1-800-GENOCIDE and you just type in your zip code, and you'll get referred right to your congressperson. You have a choice, congressperson, senator, or governor. It's really easy. They've taken away the transaction cost, the collective action problem. They've just made it where you can just do it on your cell phone. It's right there. The other thing they've done, which is really funny in Washington, I guess nothing about genocide is remotely funny, but what's funny is to see the reaction to the second thing they've done, which is they've created genocide grades for members of Congress. So you actually get anywhere from an A to an F. And you get an A if you're like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton for that matter, and you're very outspoken, you support all the right diplomatic initiatives and the hybrid force, the UN force, and you speak out and you do your part and you write your editorials, and you can get, I think Obama has an A minus and Hillary has a B plus or something like that. I think they're reserving A for when something actually happens. But the people who have D minuses, they go crazy. That's the funny part. They just go running around there like, how am I getting a D minus? I don't understand. Like, what have I done? Well, they just haven't shown up for hearings. They've never spoken out about it. They voted against appropriations that would keep the refugee camps. So you watch these members of Congress and their staff members trying to, it's a race to the top for once rather than a race to the bottom as they try to just eke out a B minus, like you guys, eking out a B or a B minus, right? You'll do what it takes once you know what it takes. And at least maybe I'm speaking for my students, but it's an amazing thing. What they've done is they've made the response to genocide more political than it's ever been before. And it doesn't, it turns out, take a whole large number of people. It probably doesn't take a majority or even a plurality of the American people to get the attention of members of Congress. There are just not that many people who do call their congresspeople. And I know from having worked in Obama's office for a year, actually in the Senate office, we sit around with the senator and talk about, what are the calls we're getting this week? Well, most of the calls are about getting out of Iraq. Some of the calls are about the deficit. Some of them are about health care. But right up there, usually in the top 5, was the number of calls about Darfur. Again, of all places, given everything else going on in this country's life. Now, what is it? As I said, part of it is this moral, this sort of reaction to genocide. It is sort of atop the hierarchy of the horribles, people taking that responsibility seriously. Part of it is just it took on a life of its own, and it became a thing, and there was a kind of contagion effect to it. Some of it is displaced anxiety about American foreign policy more generally that gets channeled through Darfur because it's a place that the United States has a chance to do good, hasn't yet, in people's eyes, done bad, and almost a chance to recoup. I think in some ways people must be viewing it that way. It's hard to tell what motivates different people. But the fact is that every presidential candidate involved in the election, from Dennis Kucinich to Ron Paul to Rudy Giuliani to Barack Obama, all of them have very, very sophisticated plans for what they would do about Darfur. And in no former presidential election has any presidential candidate had to have a plan about what to do about genocide anywhere. Indeed, in the 2000 election, when Gore and George W. Bush were asked by Jim Lehrer how they, about Rwanda, then candidate Bush's response was, and I'm quoting, "I'm not in favor of genocide." I'm quoting, sadly, but it's good that it's not in favor, but not in favor of genocide, but it's not in America's national interest to stop it, period. There's not a single candidate now who would say that about Darfur. They may believe it about Darfur. They may believe it's not in the national interest, especially given the scope of national interest issues they have to worry about, but they will not say it because of this constituency. The other effect of the constituency, briefly, is that there is a divestment movement now afoot on college campuses. So far, 50 universities and 15 states, full states, in the case of states, their pension funds, in the case of universities, their stock portfolios have all divested themselves of stocks belonging to companies doing business in Sudan. Now, that has less of an impact, that has almost no impact on American companies. Who it's really affecting right now are Chinese companies like PetroChina, where, again, U.S. stock holdings, are holding stock in a company like that and now have to get rid of those stocks because they're seen as tainted stocks. So in a funny way, the American consumer or the American advocate is almost bypassing the U.S. government and going directly to China and going directly to the government that, as I'll talk about now here just in closing, has substantial leverage over Sudan and needs to be brought into line. But that's a kind of endangered peoples movement with a pretty impressive sophistication, again, for only having come into existence just a couple years ago. So that's one part of the current reality that's very, very important. So I'd like to now just close with an account of the bad news and an account of the fixes and what will need to be done in order for genocide, for us not to be talking 50 years from now about a second age of genocide or another, the continued age of genocide. So here's the bad news. Number one, of course, genocide in Darfur continues. 400,000 people have been killed. There are an estimated 2 to 3 million people in refugee camps and displaced person camps. And those people in those camps are more and more vulnerable the longer time passes and the longer they're left alone. They're more vulnerable because they get, as some of you know this, they get humanitarian aid from governments like ours. We pay for most of the humanitarian aid. $2.5 billion worth of humanitarian aid has gone to people in these camps. That's, again, very much the product of this pressure from the movement. But that humanitarian aid, the dirty secret about it is you can't eat it unless you can heat it. And you can't heat it unless you can go and get firewood in order to actually cook, because it's just like almost like a stone. So what happens is, as time has been, initially it was always bad because the Janjaweed, the militia who put people in the camps in the first place, are patrolling around, still looking to rape African women, still looking to kill African men, still just patrolling. Nobody's stopping them. There's no protection forces there. It's been a strictly humanitarian response to a political and a military problem. So they're there, and initially women used to have to go to get firewood just a half a kilometer or half a mile. Then they had to go a mile. Now they had to go 2 miles, 5 miles. The more you use up the wood around the camp, the further you have to go. So every day that we sit here and this problem goes unsolved, women are making more and more daily Sophie's choices about whether to feed their families and risk rape, or to stay in the camp with their family and stay secure, but actually go hungry. And there are, all kinds of fixes, solar cookers and things that people have experimented with. But the fact of the matter is, it's just getting more and more dangerous for people in these camps. That's the bad news. And there is a protection force that has been authorized to go to Darfur. We can talk about it in the discussion. 26,000 UN peacekeepers and African Union peacekeepers are supposed to go. But the problem is, this movement that exists in this country doesn't exist anyplace else. It's pretty much just an American movement so far. And so we know how our government would respond without pressure, with all the other things it has on its plate. Well, other governments are the same. They don't gravitate toward these issues naturally. Something has to provoke them. Something has to press them to do so, and that hasn't really happened. So that's one set of facts. The other is that, unfortunately, U.S. influence, fortunately or unfortunately, but in the case of genocide, unfortunately, U.S. influence is on the wane. And what is U.S. influence? When I think about U.S. influence, and this is important for me in order to also think about recovery, but I think about 3 things. One, American hard power, which is military and economic power, vastly undermined, military power vastly undermined by having 2 live battle fronts. Again, nobody here needs to be told about military readiness and the 4th and 5th tours that military families are being forced to serve, or the reservists or the National Guard, or how broken or wounded, severely wounded, our military preparedness is. Economically, going from, again, a surplus to a deficit so quickly, and not much of a sign on the horizon as to how we may reverse that, being indebted to China, being indebted to a very, very powerful country. So that's hard power. But the other components of influence that I think are important to think about are second, other people's perception that we're using our power properly. Legitimacy. I'll call that legitimacy. And that, of course, with Abu Ghraib, with debates over torture, with extraordinary rendition, with the war in Iraq itself, it's just an erosion in international faith in the good intentions of and the righteousness of American foreign policy, which is it's maybe only a small factor. But when you combine that with eroded hard power, it's an important one. And then the third factor behind influence, and again, I think about all these in terms of how you turn it around, but is other people's perception that we're using our power competently. And so if you take hard power, legitimacy, and competence, then you really start to see where we're going and how we need to, what needs to change. Competence, it's not just Iraq. It's the twin pillars of Iraq and Katrina in a very, very short, basically simultaneously. So U.S. influence on the wane. So we got all this movement and the U.S. government all dressed up with no place to go, but when it snaps its fingers in international institutions, it doesn't achieve what it once might have achieved. Then you have the rise of China, which is not just an economic powerhouse, but is now throwing its weight around geopolitically. Then you have what Tom Friedman calls petro-authoritarianism, the rise of Russia, Venezuela, Iran, countries that are throwing their weight around because they have this natural resource base, and because of the rise of China and India, oil becoming ever more precious, nobody ending their dependence on it. If anything, it's just becoming hoarded more and more. So suddenly, the sole superpower that used to be talked about in the 1990s has a lot of company. And most of the company isn't interested in thinking about human rights or genocide or crimes against humanity. Far from it. I mean, from China's standpoint, if the United States has this movement and they're obsessing and giving genocide grades and so forth about Darfur, perfect. Because we get to go in and just get the oil. We have no sanctions. We have no pushback domestically. So it's a really, really problematic moment. And the final among the facts, and then the fixes will come here in closing. But the final fact is that something that you might call the Iraq syndrome. And this is a domestic dynamic, certainly, but it's also an international phenomenon. Iraq has so tainted, not because it should have, but because the language used to justify Iraq was moral language in large measure, but it has tainted arguments that we make, that Americans make abroad about human rights, about even genocide prevention. It's tainted in two ways. One, I don't think people think we're telling the truth, because that wasn't, of course, the motive behind the invasion of Iraq, although some in the administration certainly were motivated by human rights. The bulk of the effort was not about the Iraqis, as was demonstrated in the form that the invasion took and the planning or lack of planning thereof. But it's not just the suspiciousness about American motives. It's also the kind of specter of quagmire. Countries didn't need another excuse not to think about foreign life. They were heading in that direction anyway, but now what you've done is just created a specter that if you do, the sort of bad shorthanded lesson of Iraq has been, oh, that's what happens when you try to help people. That's not, of course, what Iraq actually represents. Indeed, Iraq represents, that's what happens when you go to war on specious grounds with no international legitimacy and don't plan at all for what you do in war. That might be a better lesson to be learned, but instead there's a tendency to cast with a very, very broad brush what happened. As a result, just about anything that might smack of anything similar gets tainted by association. So what do we do? What do we do other than elect Barack Obama president? That's the easy one. That's so easy, especially if you could all sort of migrate to Iowa and New Hampshire. First of all, what do we do about genocide? Just 3 points to make here in closing, and then I want to open it up. What do we do about genocide? My friend and great colleague John Prendergast talks, I think, really helpfully about the 3 Ps. And when he talks about the 3 Ps in the context of genocide or in the context of Darfur, he talks about punishment. And we have a new international criminal court. We have the Ying Sari arrest in Cambodia. We have abortive efforts at judicial approaches. But punishment can just be stigma. It can be asset freezes. It can be making travel more difficult. There's all kinds of incentives and disincentives that one can work with. And that should be easier than it's proving. Protection, getting that force of 26,000 into Darfur, figuring out how to do civilian protection more generally. I mean, why was Iraq lost, apart from all the problematic reasons for going to war in the first place? No security for civilians, nothing. Looting gave way to criminality, gave way to sectarian violence. No physical security. The international system is bad at protection. And no government or set of governments have ever made civilian protection a priority, and it shows again and again and again. And then the third P of the 3 Ps is peace process. And here again, I refer you, in the context of Darfur, that means an energized, top-level diplomatic process. We know what it looks like when the Bush administration is serious. We know what it looks like. It shows when they're serious. And that means appointing somebody very, very senior and being relentless, not only about going to Sudan and going to Darfur, but going to meet with stakeholders like the Chinese, like the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and so forth. The 3 Ps. But in terms of peace processes more globally, because everything is connected to everything else now. Here I will echo my candidate's admonition that we get in the room with our foes, that we don't create conditions for negotiation. We, of course, prepare for negotiation, but we understand that you never negotiate in fear, as Kennedy said, but you never fear to negotiate. You get in the room. And by getting in the room, if in the case of Iran or Ahmadinejad, you undermine the legitimacy of the government that you meet with, because they can no longer point to you as the problem, then they become the problem because they're the obstacle. And even if you fail to extract concessions, you have presented a very different face of American foreign policy, a much more conciliatory and compromising face. And it means that if you do fail, you have much more international wind at your back for whatever the next step is. So those are the 3 Ps, I think, prescriptively in terms of policy, whether it comes to atrocity or when it comes to peace more generally. Second thing, fix. Very hard, is we got to figure out the China part of this puzzle. It is a superpower. It is a 21st century power. It is emboldened by America's distractions and by America's erosions of influences right now. It is pillaging developing countries with very little consequence at home, and so far very little consequence in developing countries. Indeed, the developing countries' hostility to the United States is leading many of them, including countries like South Africa, big, powerful countries within their regions, to, in a very short-sighted way, I think, just kind of close ranks behind the Chinese, buying arguments that they never would have bought. If you were talking about apartheid in South Africa, they'd never be talking about the importance of sovereignty and so forth. But now they're talking about that when it comes to talking about Mugabe, closing ranks in this kind of developing world, southern, anti-Western coalition. And we have to figure out how to work with this. Now, whether that's tapping China's reputational concerns, drawing the link between their economic interests and peace, because there is a link there, and the importance of stability, using their language, not ours, the language of responsibilities and not of rights, perhaps, but somehow making China a more responsible, not making it, urging it, somehow finessing it, being a part of encouraging it to be a more responsible global citizen. Hugely important to figuring out the genocide conundrum. Or else what you're going to see is the withering of the UN, because China's at the Security Council, and if it can't be brought to believe that some of these issues are central issues or important issues to be dealt with, the UN itself will wither on the vine, because the Security Council will not be a place that citizens will want their government to turn. Final, and this time truly final, fix, but the hardest, but the one that implicates us the most, I think. We as a country have to somehow self-correct. And what that means is moving away from a period in which we can all, especially those of you who are in the Darfur movement or the anti-genocide movement, kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, wow, where did this movement come from? And isn't it amazing? We've convinced George Bush at a very busy time to speak out on genocide and on Darfur. Instead of taking solace in that, I think it's time to take note of how unsustainable it is. It is totally unsustainable to do morality a la carte. You can't do morality a la carte. It turns out, in a globalized world, you can't kind of take half a loaf and maybe not a full loaf. The half a loaf, it doesn't work if the other half of the loaf is so tainted, so uncredible internationally. And I give you the example of this. The best example is to denounce the genocide in Darfur, as the Bush administration has done rightly, more than any other country on the earth. But they do that in a given week on a Monday, and then say that waterboarding is a no-brainer on a Tuesday. What then happens on a Wednesday when you go to an international institution and you want to raise troops to go and be part of the UN Protection Force in Darfur? People just assume that the only reason you're talking about Darfur is that maybe it's a way of, again, criticizing an Arab government or the oil, or we've got to rehabilitate our foreign policy more generally. It doesn't mean you can do it overnight, and it doesn't mean that there's not a degree of inconsistency or selectivity that is inevitable. But we can do better. We can do better. We're America. Let me leave it there. Thank you. How do we have a person with a microphone and
Hello? Yes, my name is Joso, and I'm Burmese activist here from Fort Wayne. And I organized the petition drive in 2003 for asking resolution for Burma at the United Nations. Even President Bush was responded to me directly, but it was end up vetoed by China and Russia. My question is, how Burmese people inside Burma and outside Burma to approach China and Russia for no veto again?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is, the last time that the effort was made to bring Burma up before the Security Council, China, just what I've talked about a little bit, but China and Russia vetoed it, and the question is how can the Burmese have more success, I guess, cutting through the impasse of Chinese intransigence. It's really a difficult question. I think the one thing I would say is that we talk about China, or as I mean, exactly what I'm going to complain about now is what I did in my talk, so no glass houses here. We talk about China, we talk about Russia, we talk about the United States. If the United States could bracket China and Russia for the time being and actually convince other potentially much more likely like-minded countries to join it. So if, for instance, the European Union had been of one mind, if Canada had been of one mind, if countries in Latin America that have suffered human rights abuses that themselves have used the human rights dialogue had been of one mind, if potentially you could peel away countries like East Timor or Australia within, the Asian bloc, perhaps not East Timor, not a hugely powerful country, but the point is, if you create what now has a dirty name, which is a coalition of the willing, a coalition of the diplomatically willing, of the morally willing, of the humanely willing, and at that point, you go and you have that conversation with China or with Russia, it is a different conversation, I think. It doesn't mean that it works, and it doesn't mean that the UN Security Council is going to be the place where these kinds of things get settled. I really do think that what is going to happen in the next 10 years is, if the veto continues to be levied and to be used in circumstances like this one, and it's not only on human rights issues, it's also going to be used on Iran, on security issues. I mean, even if Ahmadinejad had, a nuclear weapon tomorrow, I think it'd be really hard to convince Russia to be part of sanctioning him right now, given Putin's own. So if it ceases to be the place that you can go to try, to really move as it were, the ball down the field, other places will emerge. It'll be like a marketplace where you'll start to see, whether it's NATO or ASEAN or the G8 or Concert of Democracies, which, gets a lot of traction, but you'll start to see other bodies, which really I think would be such a shame because they will lack the universal composition of the United Nations, but fundamentally, universalism isn't enough. I mean, in the end, in the eyes of the Burmese or in the eyes of people who are suffering, and certainly it's not enough in the eyes of some Western governments, it has to be organizations will prove their worth on their ability to respond to crises. So it could be that in and of itself is reason enough for China and Russia to give a little, that their desire to see the UN Security Council as the place that people continue to come. But I think, as I started to say at the end, it's very tempting, especially for you and for the large Burmese community here, to look at Burma a la carte, or for me to look at Darfur a la carte, or Zimbabwe a la carte, or Iraq, getting out of Iraq a la carte. But all of these are connected to one another. And so in order for the United States to be the kind of constructive player you want it to be, and to have the best chance of being able to advance Burma's agenda in international institutions, unfortunately, that requires thinking about Guantanamo. It's crazy, right? You should be able to, it's hard enough to get a focus on Burma, the idea that Burma somehow gets associated, but it will, our ability to be a part of mustering that coalition for your people is going to depend on our standing to be, to be able to speak out on behalf of human rights. We have to have both trains running at once. We can't not speak about Burma because we have credibility problems. We have to keep speaking about Burma, but we have to be more attuned to when and why people are shying away from taking our positions. And some of it is just their own economic interests, but some of it is that they just want to do the opposite of what we say right now. And it's a deeply unsatisfying answer given the stakes of what's happening in Burma right now. But thank you for your question and for your advocacy. I'll let you, you choose.
Okay. You said that you're supporting Barack Obama, and I was just
Did I mention that?
Actually, I heard you say it on Charlie Rose, so it must be true. But what I would like to know is, should he become president, as you so fervently hope, would he stand up and support the placing of genocide on the Armenian and what happened in Armenia and the Turkish? Because, as you know, we just had it in the Congress and it got shut down because, again, it's not the right time.
It's never the right time.
When does it ever become the right time?
Right.
And once again, with China, does China approve of genocide? Do you think that they might have the fear of what they're doing in Tibet might come home to bite them?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I'll take the second half first, just because to stay on the China point. I mean, it's not just China's very specific fear of being accused of committing genocide in Tibet that makes it so committed to excluding consideration of human beings in foreign policy or in international relations. That's huge. But it's also just its basic internal human rights practices. It just doesn't want to itself be accountable, and therefore the last thing on earth it's going to do is make Sudan accountable. Huge factor. I do think it was interesting. It's funny, your questions are in some ways linked. The same week that the Turkish government succeeded in killing the Armenian Genocide Resolution, which I guess is now 3 weeks ago, Bush met with the Dalai Lama in the White House and seemed to have no problem, or at least didn't, evince. It's just fascinating to me that he'd sooner meet with the Dalai Lama and alienate China, inevitably, the most powerful superpower probably in human history in 100 years, who knows, but, and a very significant number 2 superpower today, sooner do that than actually just tell the truth and about the, Turkish genocide and endure what would be, I'm sure there would be short-term costs, but Turkey's so much more dependent on the United States than China, who's our banker. China's our banker now, So it's like Citibank, our ATM. But so I find that fascinating. And back to Barack, he's very outspoken on the Armenian genocide and was on the record as saying he would have supported the Senate resolution had it come to that. I will grant that, it's easy to say that when you know it's not coming. But, he just, again and again, whenever he's asked, he just says, look, it happened. I mean, if I say I got to go decide, I turn it into something more than it is. It happened. It happened. Genocide happened. He doesn't say it because it would be controversial. Genocide happened. So, I wrote a piece and got a lot of grief for writing a piece saying that honesty is the best policy and that we shouldn't predicate our relationship with Turkey on a lie a few weeks ago when the resolution was up for passage. And the national security establishment thought this was a terrible line of argument. And I completely understand their argument. It really, of all the bad timing periods, this does seem to be probably the worst. But it's only going to get more like that. We're only getting more and more dependent on Turkey. And as Europe turns its back on Turkey, the levers we have over Turkey to say, hey, just behave and maybe we'll help you get membership and so forth, our leverage is going to shrink. And the sort of, just the abscess in the Turkish-U.S. relationship that is caused by this denialism recurs and recurs and recurs, and just the damage persists. It's just like, it is like a bad tooth. Just do it. Just say it. Get it out. So now it's been delayed. The Armenians that I know say that they're consoled, that they feel like this really was about the Iraq War, and that there was a lot of whispering done behind the scenes. Like, we know it's genocide. We really will do it next time. But, it's hard to see when the, quote, right time really comes. And I think, in a way, your suggestion is the right one, which is whoever the next president is, again, if it's Obama, that just within a week of being president, no fuss, no fanfare, and just be, oh, by the way, a genocide happened in Turkey in 1915. And just say it. And because it's the build-up, then it's like becomes about all the phone calls that the president of Turkey has made in order to stop the resolution from going forward. And, it's a sort of compounding humiliation. But generally, it's a lie and a denial, an act of denial, and it's just going to continue to corrode what could be a very productive relationship if we don't get it out of the way. Yes?
To try to stay on Turkey and Iraq for just a second. And the Kurdish population, I guess I don't fully understand the problem with the Kurds. Here's sort of a two-part question. It seems like we do have moral high ground in Iraq if we talk about removing the regime that perpetrated genocide against the Kurds. And I believe your candidate is in favor of withdrawing from Iraq, which I know is popular at the time. But in the context of the discussion, do we not have the moral high ground in Iraq if we look at the Kurdish genocide? And then to go to Turkey, in both Gulf conflicts, during, in this case, after, in the previous one, Turkey incurred into Kurdish land, by not focusing on the Armenian genocide and dealing with these issues. Are we allowing the Turks to beat up on the Kurds? Is that genocide? Does that have a connection to what the Iraqis were doing?
I think that on the question of the moral high ground, there are very few categorical imperatives in foreign policy. You don't get points for having a pure heart, or for and you don't lose points forever by having an impure heart. A lot of what matters in foreign policy are effects. It's consequentialism. It's like I was saying, earlier about, maybe it wasn't here, maybe it's to the students. I think I'm losing my mind. But in talking about Chechnya, about whether we would go to, what we would do when if Putin committed genocide against the Chechens, we wouldn't invade militarily, even though that would be bad, because we wouldn't want to risk a nuclear war with Putin in order to stop a genocide against the Chechens, right? I mean, there's some sort of check. Now, those people who supported the war in Iraq, many of them were motivated by what you describe. I described that in my book, killing of 200,000 to 300,000 Kurds in the Anfal campaign, the gassing, the use of chemical weapons. I mean, it was a powerful summons to do something. For me, that summons came in 1988 when the genocide was underway, and 15 years later when the arguments were made by the same people who had doubled our aid to Saddam Hussein's regime after chemical weapons were used. Those arguments just it sounded like window dressing to me. It sounded like a war was being fought for other reasons, and then we were invoking this thing that would appeal to good citizens and people around the world who really cared about the genocide. But I think military force is so risky, consequentially, right, that you'd really have to, for me, for genocide to be a trigger, and it can be an excuse for delay and can be counterproductive to what I'm about to say, but there has to be a clear and present danger, and not a punishment 15 years later for something that already occurred. He should be punished. He should be tried. There should have been a massive international effort to get rid of him and send him to The Hague like Charles Taylor. But that's different than, invading a country and revealing in the way that you invade, in fact, your disregard or your neglect of Iraqi life. You know, in other words, if that had been the precipitant, if what motivates you and what you think, you know, gives us could have given us the moral high ground, what would have really given us the moral high ground would have been to get involved for that reason, and to show by how we got involved with the planning we did, by parking the tanks in front of the hospitals instead of just in front of the oil ministries, by sending enough troops, you know, by sending very clear orders to our soldiers not to torture, by training our soldiers in advance in Islamic culture and by actually having Arabic speakers as part of our. There are 1,000 ways you could. It still would have been really hard, and you know probably wouldn't have worked anyway because it's just such a combustible mix there. But I think that the moral high ground is going to be in the eye of the beholder, and it's going to depend an awful lot on consequences. And when surveys show today that something like 80% of Iraqis, you know, would prefer the stability of Saddam than the bloodshed and the unpredictability and the tens and maybe even hundreds of thousands of lives lost since, it's hard to take either that moral high ground starts to feel like a pile of sand, you know, to me anyway. And I think in the eyes of anybody other than the Kurds, who are of course still very grateful for what they have. In terms of your second question, I don't know. I don't see a genocidal dimension because the Turkish incursion or invasion of Kurdistan, if it comes in the next few days, which I think it probably will, in fairness, does seem very rooted in PKK Kurdish terrorist attacks across the border. It's hard to imagine in the United States that we would sort of remain docile for very long if Mexican terrorists came across and began killing people in New Mexico or in Texas or wherever. Like, you know, it's whatever about Turkish denialism about what they did, it is asking a lot to kind of hang back if the Americans and the Kurds collectively can't rein in. I think we have to ask them. I don't think they should, obviously. I want to be clear there, but I'm just saying I don't think we can assume that just because the Turks are crossing the border that they're out to exterminate or destroy Kurdish life. It feels like there's a precipitant cause that makes their argument that this is about national security quite credible. I still think we need to use all what little diplomatic leverage we have or what leverage we have to get them not to do that, because it's just going to inflame and perhaps turn into something of the kind that you describe. But it doesn't feel, you know, the Turks have a tradition of not recognizing Kurds and so forth, and so you could say, well, that plus the invasion, maybe that means it's genocidal, but it feels discreet, you know. But for the PKK attacks, I don't think there'd be a Turkish invasion. Doesn't feel like this is Turkey like looking for a pretext. It feels like it's Turkey having to respond to domestic outrage over the deaths of Turkish civilians and police. I leave it to my. What are you called again? You guys have funny names. What are you called again? Ambassadons, exactly.
Thank you. I lived in Turkey in 1970s.
Where?
In Turkey.
Oh my goodness,
The
this is the all-Turk.
The Kurdish issue, it has been for generations, you know, a very near genocide within Turkey. They weren't allowed poetry, music, language by official government. They weren't allowed to teach it in their neighborhood schools in eastern Turkey.
Yep. Mountain Turks,
And
they call them. Mountain Turks.
Well, they're Kurds. It's a whole different language even. And it's very similar to other ethnic groups in terms of oppression. And, you know, one of the things that we might someday learn about Iraq was that the protection that we offered the Kurds in the north, and now they learn democracy on their own. If the Kurds were allowed some expression, they would not be so angry in eastern Turkey, and the PKK would have no teeth. But the Turks, as they did the genocide, continue that with ethnicity and Kurdish. The real question that I have, and again, I've worked with 30 years with refugees here in this city from many nations. One of the things that I find real troubling all the time is that people tend to sort of like, as you suggested, you know, the human rights du jour, and how the legislature will pat itself on the back for the bill against investment in the Sudan for 300 Darfurians in Indiana, but they will ignore the same legislation that could assist 3,000 Burmese in Fort Wayne. And maybe, Wynne, you could carry this. In other words, many times we don't see the connection between Burma and Iraq and Darfur that comes through influence in China. But then we'll pat ourselves on the back for giving $100 a year to the Darfur movement. But at the same time, we will spend $3,000 to $6,000 per adult on foreign oil, interest that's going to China. And we, as Americans, do not ever seem to understand that our economic choices, our selfishness on a world basis, is in many cases has given China the power they have. We sold ourselves down the road. And my suggestion is that those of you who write about this could someday help us understand that we're all in this together. In other words, the Americans that are making sacrifices in Iraq are very few, mostly military families, and some Iraqis and others. But the average American is making no sacrifice at all. Mostly middle class, upper class, nothing. And my admonition to media is that someday you might want to help teach the rest of us that we're involved in this.
Let me just say one thing. I think it's a very good point, important point, and obviously on September 12th, when we were all told to sacrifice by going shopping, an opportunity was missed. But I do want to take issue with one part of if we lived in an ideal world, and instead of one that seems to be its diametric opposite, we would each kind of have, and this is what I'm about to say is, I suppose, provocative and maybe controversial, but we would each have the capacity to see suffering around us and calibrate our responses perfectly commensurate to the amount of pain inflicted, so that we would somehow get Darfur right and Burma right and Congo right and Iraq right and the inner city in our communities right. And, that I just don't think human nature works that way, and thus I think political nature brings out sort of aggregates the worst in some ways of human nature, occasionally sometimes a bit of the best. But, so I don't, here I am maybe sort of prepared to accept some a la carteism, in fact, or de jourism, as you put it rightly. I mean, I totally agree with your description of the phenomenon, because I think that if a young person has the experience of being part of the Darfur movement, they will literally be changed forever. They will read the newspaper differently forever, forever. And when they read about Burma and when they hear somebody talking about their experiences, they will have something to push back on. It's just like traveling abroad. If they go abroad to one place, you'd love them to go to the right place, but let them go any place. If they learn a foreign language, you'd love them to learn Arabic or Chinese or something, but let them learn Italian if they've liked Italian movies. Or, in other words, we're trying to find wedges by which people with a lot on their plates can connect with other people who aren't part of their communities and aren't part of their visceral communities of obligation. And I think it's a huge challenge, and I don't want to start wagging my finger at people who've actually, and I'm not suggesting you were, but who care about something. God love them for caring about something. And like you say, let's push back and have them care about more things, or let's use that as a wedge to caring about more things. But he who fights every battle fights none. And if we can just generate some commitment to help, if each of us could just make one individual or set of individuals' lives just a little bit different, just somebody's a little more unfortunate, whether in our own communities or in Burma, that would be amazing and rare. And so I definitely see the connectiveness, but I want to also sort of affirm the work that anybody does, and not just say, hey, because you can't do the spectrum, don't do the one thing, even though I know it creates disparities that are really problematic. But to me, the answer is fewer disparities by bringing the ship up across the board, not somehow to care about Darfur less, because God knows it deserves caring about. But thank you. Yep. Yes, thanks.
Okay, I come from Africa, and I've lived most of my life in Africa, and I came here for college and everything. But the one thing I've noticed from my perspective is that genocide seems to happen because the governments, in these countries where genocide occurs, basically aren't doing their jobs. And on top of that, the United Nations doesn't seem to really care. They have other priorities, it seems like, and that's, usually the general consensus, most people, I think, is that they're not focused on the right issues. But I was wondering, my question is, since we know really who are the evils, who is letting this happen, I mean, as the job of a government is to take care of certain necessities like safety of its people, and since for example, the Sudan, many of the Sudan's government isn't really doing that. They're not taking care of its people. And so basically, the rest of the world just sitting back and watching all this happen, in the United States being the superpower as it is, not really putting pressure or taking the leadership, like at the United Nations, and putting pressure on the Sudan's government to do something about this. So, it appears to me, my question is you said that, you're basically representing Senator Obama. And if I were to vote for Senator Obama, what changes would he make, if he were to become president? Now, I said I'm from, okay. Sorry.
When Obama becomes president in January 2009, what changes would happen? You said a lot. First of all, I think that part of what he would bring to office is something that we should all keep in mind as well, which is there are two types of governments. Those that are unable to protect their civilians or to meet those needs, and those are a prime problem on the earth right now. Afghanistan, Congo, parts of Darfur even, but when we're talking about genocide, more often than not, we're not actually talking about governments that are unable, we're talking about those that are unwilling, and indeed those that are intent on murdering their own citizens. So just to address that part of your question, I think we shouldn't lump all governments together or all harm doers together. There really is a mix. What I think Obama brings, briefly, is dirt under his fingernails and a knowledge of broken people and broken places, which is really rare for a mainstream American political candidate. I mean, for a guy to know Indonesia and to have a grandmother who lives in a hut in barefoot in rural Kenya, these are not small things. They don't have obvious immediate policy implications, but they change your sensibility, And I think that what Obama's at the centerpiece of his development platform or his foreign engagement platform is what he calls, and what Franklin Roosevelt called, freedom from fear. And that comes from, spending enough time in these communities and, frankly, in the inner city in this country. Obama has a huge amount of experience, just doesn't have Washington experience. But he has experience actually watching people decide whether they go to school or take up guns, and frankly, that's where the action is internationally right now. Is how you affect those decision, incentives and those decision matrices. How do you capture people, their hearts, their minds, their attention before they go astray and want to come and kill us or want to join a militant group. And this idea of freedom from fear, the idea that so many people around the world are living in fear. Fear that they won't be able to feed their families, fear about walking the streets, fear of corruption, fear of the militia down the corner, reliance on a rival militia so as to counteract the effect of the first militia, to actually have some experience with these issues in this country and which are, less dramatic versions on the theme, but abroad. The fact that he was a constitutional law professor, and has actually done the deed of balancing liberty and security. There's no such thing as a pure, I love civil liberties, but there's no such thing as pure civil liberties approach when you do have terrorists. It's a balance, but our balance is totally skewed right now counterproductively, so we're actually creating more security threats by our deviance from our values. The fact that you have somebody who's actually taught the Constitution, studied the historical precedents where America's gotten it wrong in the past, and then self-corrected. I want a guy who knows the Constitution, like literally marinated, who loves it. I miss it. I liked it. And then I think you see the differences he'd make and his willingness that I mentioned earlier, his willingness to talk unconditionally with even the bad guys and to pry them apart. He'll go on a listening tour in the first 100 days, but he's not going to check his principles at the door when he goes in to listen to a bad guy. He's going to bring them in and assert them, and he's very, I think, comfortable in his own skin, and it's just a great advantage of being free of the kind of Washington herd mentality that is precisely the mentality that took us to war in Iraq and that now has us, saber rattling about going to war with Iran. So my infomercial on Barack Obama is now concluded, and I hope you'll all move to Iowa shortly. Thank you so much.